The morning, Willa James found her sorrel mare standing at the fence line with a crown of blue columbine woven into her forelock. She thought at first that she had done it herself in some fugue of exhaustion and forgotten. She stood in the doorway of her small cabin with her coffee cup cooling in her hand, watching the way the early light caught the delicate petals. The braiding was meticulous, each stem tucked carefully beneath the next, the flowers still fresh with dew. But Willa had not touched her horse since turning her out to graze the evening before, and the open range stretched for miles beyond her fence, dotted with cattle and the occasional band of horses that drifted between the high meadows like clouds. She set down her cup and walked barefoot through the wet grass. Her mare, a mare she had named Clementine for the bright copper of her coat, lowered her head and blew softly into Willa's outstretched palm. The columbine was Colorado's own flower, growing wild in the mountain meadows at this elevation, and someone had picked a dozen stems and braided them with the kind of patience that spoke of practice. Willa worked the braid free carefully, not wanting to pull at the mane beneath. The flowers came away in a neat plait that she held in her palm, studying it as though it might yield some clue. The range was shared by a half-dozen homesteaders and twice that many cattle operations, and she knew most of her neighbors by sight if not by name. None of them struck her as the type to spend an evening braiding flowers into a strange horse's mane. She had moved to Colorado Territory 3 years earlier, in 1882, when the land was still raw and the towns were still finding their footing. Florence was a supply town nestled in a valley with the Arkansas River cutting through it, and her homestead sat higher up in the foothills where the air was thin and clear. She had come west after her father died, leaving her nothing but debts and a fierce need to be somewhere that did not know her as the daughter of a drunk. The land here was hard but honest, and she had built her cabin with her own hands, log by log, learning as she went. The braiding became a mystery that occupied the edges of her thoughts while she worked. She spent her days tending a small herd of cattle, mending fences, and hauling water up from the creek that ran through the bottom of her property. In the evenings, she would sit on her porch and watch the light fade over the mountains, and she would think about the unknown person who had touched her horse with such gentleness. The second time it happened, Willa was ready. She had taken to braiding wildflowers into Clementine's mane herself, just for the pleasure of it. She would walk through the meadow in the early morning and gather whatever was blooming, Indian paintbrush and lupine and wild roses, and she would work them into intricate patterns along the mare's crest. It was a small vanity, a softness she allowed herself in a life that demanded hardness most of the time. When Clementine came in from the range 4 days later, she wore a fresh braid of mountain bluebells tucked behind her ear, delicate as lace. Willa stood staring at it for a long moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Whoever was doing this had seen her own braids and answered them. She began to think of it as a conversation. She would send Clementine out with flowers in her mane, and the mare would return with different flowers woven in, sometimes in the same spots, sometimes in new places. The braiding was always careful, always respectful of the work Willa had already done. Once, she sent the mare out with a crown of wild roses, and Clementine returned with the roses still in place, but augmented with strands of purple aster. The two colors braided together so seamlessly that Willa could not tell where her work ended and the stranger's began. She asked around town carefully when she went in for supplies. The mercantile owner, a thin man named Mr. Horace who kept his accounts in a cramped hand, shook his head and said he could not imagine anyone taking the time for such foolishness. The blacksmith, a woman named Ruth who had arms like a miner and a laugh that could shake rafters, said it sounded like someone was courting Willa's horse, and maybe Willa should be flattered. Could be one of the hands from the Nichols ranch, Ruth said, hammering a shoe into shape on her anvil. They graze up in your area, don't they? They do, Willa said. The Nichols ranch was the largest operation in the valley, running several hundred head of cattle and employing a rotating crew of cowboys who drifted in and out with the seasons. She had seen them from a distance, moving cattle or mending their own fences, but she had never spoken to any of them. Ranching at this scale was a different world from her small homestead, and the men who worked it were a different breed, hardened by months in the saddle, and the kind of loneliness that came from sleeping under the stars more often than under a roof. She thought about riding over to the ranch and asking, but the idea felt too bold, too presumptuous. What would she even say? Someone is braiding flowers into my horse's mane, and I would like to know who. It sounded ridiculous even in her own head. Instead, she kept braiding. She made her patterns more elaborate, testing the limits of her own skill. She wove chains of daisies and crowns of clover. She braided sprigs of sage and strands of wild grass, mixing textures and colors until Clementine looked like she had stepped out of a fairy tale. And every time, the mare returned with an answer. The stranger's braids were different from hers, tighter and more utilitarian, but no less beautiful for their simplicity. They favored flowers that grew higher up the mountain, columbine and alpine forget-me-nots, flowers that required effort to reach. Once, Clementine came back with a single sprig of white aspen leaves woven into her forelock. The leaves turned gold at the edges, and Willa knew without question that the stranger had ridden up into the aspen groves to find them. Summer deepened into August, and the meadows turned gold under the relentless sun. Willa spent her days moving her cattle to higher pastures where the grass was still green, and she spent her evenings braiding flowers and watching the horizon. She had begun to feel a strange kinship with the unknown stranger, a sense of being seen and understood in a way she had not felt since leaving the East. Whoever they were, they understood the quiet language of small beauties, the way a braid could be a gift and a conversation all at once. It was Ruth who finally told her the truth, or at least part of it. Willa had come into town to have a wheel repaired on her wagon, and she was waiting in the smithy while Ruth heated the iron rim. I saw one of the Nichols hands in town yesterday, Ruth said, her voice casual. Big fellow, quiet type. He was buying supplies at the mercantile, and I noticed he had flowers tucked into his saddlebag. Thought it was strange at the time, but now I'm wondering if he's your mystery braider. Willa's pulse quickened. What did he look like? Tall, dark hair, built like he could pull a plow by himself if he had to. Keeps to himself mostly. I think his name is Preston. Preston Nichols, actually. He's kin to the family, but he works the range like any other hand. Preston Nichols. The name settled into Willa's mind and made a home there. She tried to picture him, this tall, quiet man who bought flowers and braided them into a stranger's horse. The image would not quite come together, but she felt the shape of it, the weight of a man who carried tenderness like a secret. She did not see him right away. The range was vast, and their paths did not cross naturally. But she began to notice things. Hoof prints near the creek that were too large to be Clementine's. A place where the grass was flattened, as though a horse had stood for a long time. Once, she found a single blue columbine lying on a rock near the water, freshly picked and not yet wilted, and she knew he had been there recently. The first time she saw him, it was by accident. She had ridden out to check on her cattle, and she had stopped to let Clementine drink from a stream that fed down from the higher elevations. She was sitting on a flat rock with her boots off, dangling her feet in the cold water, when she heard the sound of hooves on stone. She looked up and saw him. He was riding a bay stallion, a massive animal with a dark mane and a white blaze down its face, and he sat in the saddle with the easy grace of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. He was exactly as Ruth had described, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and a face that was all hard angles and sunburn. They stared at each other for a long moment. Willa's heart was hammering in her chest, and she had the sudden absurd thought that she should have worn a better shirt, something that was not faded and patched at the elbows. But Preston's stallion was already moving, stepping into the stream with a splash, and the moment broke. "Afternoon," Preston said. His voice was low and rough, like he did not use it often. "Afternoon," Willa replied. She was trying not to stare at his stallion's mane, but she could not help herself. It was braided. Not everywhere, just along the crest. A single long braid woven with strands of wild grass and tiny white flowers she did not recognize. Preston followed her gaze, and something shifted in his expression. A flicker of something that might have been embarrassment or pleasure or both. He dismounted in a smooth motion and let his stallion drink beside Clementine. The two horses greeted each other with soft nickers as though they were old friends. "That's a fine mare," Preston said, nodding toward Clementine. "Thank you. That's a fine stallion. His name is Jasper." "Clementine," Willa said, and then felt foolish for introducing her horse as though it were a person. But Preston just nodded, his expression serious. "Suits her." They stood in awkward silence while the horses drank. Willa was acutely aware of her bare feet. Her wet trousers rolled up to her knees, the way her hair had come loose from its braid and was hanging in her face. Preston was looking everywhere but at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon or the water or the trees, and she realized with a sudden clarity that he was just as uncomfortable as she was. "I've seen your braids," she said finally, because someone had to say it. "In Clementine's mane." Preston went very still. For a moment she thought he might deny it or make an excuse, but then he nodded slowly. "I figured you might have. They're beautiful." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes were a startling shade of gray like river stones. "So are yours." Something warm unfurled in Willa's chest. I wondered who was doing it. I thought I was going crazy at first, finding flowers I didn't remember braiding. A small smile tugged at the corner of Preston's mouth, barely there and gone just as quickly. "I didn't mean to spook you. I just saw her out on the range one morning, all braided up with roses, and she was so pretty I couldn't help myself. I thought I'd return the favor. You've been returning it for weeks." "I know." He shifted his weight, his hands resting on his belt buckle. "I should have introduced myself sooner. It felt strange doing it this way, but I liked it, the not knowing, like we were talking without words." "I liked it too," Willa said softly. "I still do." They stood there in the stream, the water rushing around their horses' legs, and the silence between them was different now, easier. Preston reached up and ran a hand along Jasper's neck, and Willa noticed the way his fingers moved, deft and gentle. "Where did you learn to braid like that?" she asked. "My mother," Preston said. "She used to braid my sister's hair every morning before school. I'd watch her while I was waiting for breakfast. She said it was a way of showing love, taking the time to make something beautiful." "You have sisters, 3 of them, all back in Missouri." There was something wistful in his voice, a longing for something far away. "I came out here 5 years ago to work for my uncle's ranch. Figured I'd make my fortune and go back, but the land gets under your skin. Now I can't imagine leaving." "I know what you mean," Willa said. "I came here to get away, and now I can't picture being anywhere else." They talked while the horses grazed, easy conversation that meandered from topic to topic like the stream itself. Preston told her about the ranch, about the cattle drives and the long months sleeping rough. Willa told him about her homestead, about the cabin she had built, and the challenges of running a small operation on her own. They discovered they were neighbors in the loosest sense, their lands overlapping in the high meadows where the grazing was best, and they had probably passed within a mile of each other a dozen times without knowing. When the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, Preston swung back into his saddle. "I should get back. We're moving cattle tomorrow and I need to be up before dawn." "I should head back too," Willa said, though she was reluctant to see him go. Preston hesitated, his hand resting on the saddle horn. "Would you mind if I kept braiding? Now that you know it's me." "I'd mind if you stopped," Willa said, and she meant it. His smile was wider this time, less guarded. "Good, I'll keep an eye out for Clementine. And I'll keep an eye out for Jasper." They parted ways at the stream, riding in opposite directions, but Willa felt lighter than she had in months. She kept turning over the conversation in her mind, replaying the way he had smiled, the way he had looked at her when she complimented his braiding. She had not expected to like him so much, this quiet cowboy who hid his tenderness behind a wall of reserve. The braiding continued, but now it had a name and a face attached to it. Willa braided Clementine's mane with even more care, knowing that Preston would see her work and understand the effort behind it. She experimented with new patterns, new combinations of flowers, and she found herself riding the high meadows more often, hoping for another chance encounter. They met again a week later, this time at dawn. Willa was checking her fences when she saw Jasper grazing near the edge of her property, Preston sitting on a rock nearby with a cup of coffee in his hands. He waved when he saw her, a casual gesture that made her heart skip. "Morning," he called. "Hope you don't mind. Jasper wandered over here and I figured I'd let him graze while I waited for the day to warm up." "I don't mind," Willa said, dismounting. Clementine and Jasper greeted each other like old companions, and Willa wondered how many times they had found each other on the open range, these two horses who had brought their riders together. Preston handed her a cup of coffee from a battered tin pot he had balanced on the rock. "I made extra. Thought you might be out early." The coffee was strong and bitter, and Willa drank it gratefully. They sat side by side on the rock, watching the sun climb over the peaks, and the silence between them was comfortable, the kind that did not need filling. Preston's shoulder was inches from hers, and she was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Can I ask you something?" Preston said after a while. "Of course. Why do you braid flowers into her mane?" "Most folks would say it's frivolous, a waste of time." Willa thought about it, trying to put into words something she had never articulated even to herself. "I think it's because there's so much hardness out here, so much work and struggle. Braiding the flowers makes me feel like there's still room for beauty, even in the middle of all that. It reminds me that I'm not just surviving, I'm living." Preston nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "That's why I started doing it too, after I saw your braids. It felt like you were saying something important, something I needed to hear." "What was I saying?" He looked at her then, and his expression was open in a way it had not been before. "That it's okay to care about small things, that it's okay to be gentle, even when the world tells you to be hard." Willa's throat tightened. She had not expected him to understand so completely, to put into words what she had only felt. "I'm glad you heard it. I'm glad you said it." They finished their coffee in silence, and then Preston stood and brushed the dust from his trousers. "I should get to work. We're branding this week, and my uncle will have my hide if I'm late." "Will I see you again?" Willa asked, and then immediately felt foolish for the naked hope in her voice, but Preston just smiled. "Count on it. I'll be riding through your area tomorrow evening. Maybe we could meet by the creek again." "I'd like that." He tipped his hat to her and mounted Jasper in one fluid motion. Willa watched him ride away, her heart full of something she could not quite name. It felt like the beginning of something, this tentative connection they were building, and she wanted to hold on to it with both hands. They began to meet regularly, always by accident, always in the quiet places where their lands overlapped. Sometimes they would talk for hours, sitting by the creek or riding side by side through the meadows. Other times they would barely speak, content to share the silence and the space. Preston was a man of few words, but the words he chose were always careful, always meant, and Willa found herself treasuring them like the wildflowers he braided into Jasper's mane. She learned that he was 26, 3 years older than her, and that he had come west to escape the expectations of his family, who had wanted him to take over the family farm in Missouri. He loved the work of ranching but hated the politics of it, the constant negotiation and compromise required to keep a large operation running. He was happiest on the open range, alone with his horse and the sky, and he spoke about the mountains with a reverence that bordered on worship. Willa told him about her father, about the drinking and the debts and the relief she had felt when he finally died. She told him about the loneliness of homesteading alone, the nights when the silence was so complete it felt like a presence. She told him about her dreams of building something lasting, a ranch of her own that she could pass down to children she did not yet have but hoped for someday. Preston listened without judgment, his gray eyes steady on hers, and when she was finished, he reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her beyond a handshake, and the contact sent a jolt through her entire body. His palm was rough and calloused, his fingers strong, and he held her hand like it was something precious. "You're going to do it," he said quietly. "Build that ranch. I can see it in you. You're too stubborn to fail." Willa laughed, a sound that was half sob. "Stubborn, that's one way to put it. It's a compliment. Out here, stubborn is what keeps you alive." They started braiding each other's horses in plain sight after that, meeting in the meadows and spending an hour or more working flowers and grasses into the horses' manes while they talked. Preston's braids were always tight and precise, a reflection of his careful nature, while Willa's were looser and more whimsical. They would critique each other's work with mock seriousness, pointing out uneven sections or flowers that were wilting. And then they would ride together until the sun set, and they had to part ways. Willa found herself thinking about Preston at odd hours, in the middle of chores or late at night when she should have been sleeping. She thought about the way his hands moved when he braided, the quiet focus in his expression. She thought about the way he laughed, rare and genuine, and the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention. She was falling for him, slowly and inevitably, like a river carving through stone. She did not know if he felt the same until the day he showed up at her cabin unannounced. It was late afternoon, and she was mending a bridle on her porch when she heard the sound of hooves. She looked up to see Preston riding toward her, Jasper's mane braided with so many flowers it looked like a garden. "What's all this?" Willa asked, standing and shading her eyes against the sun. Preston dismounted and walked up to the porch, his hat in his hands. He looked nervous, a rare expression on his usually composed face. "I wanted to ask you something, and I figured I'd better make an impression first." "You've already made an impression. Good. That's good." He took a breath, and then the words came out in a rush. "Would you come to the county fair with me? It's next weekend in Florence, and I thought maybe we could go together. As more than friends." Willa's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "As more than friends, as courting," Preston said, his eyes meeting hers. "If you're willing." She wanted to say yes immediately, but she forced herself to slow down to make sure this was real. "You want to court me?" "I've wanted to for weeks. I just didn't know how to ask. I'm not good at this, Willa. I don't have pretty words or fancy manners. But I care about you and I want to see where this goes. Willa stepped down from the porch and stood in front of him, so close she could see the individual sun-bleached strands in his dark hair. I want that too. The relief on his face was almost comical. Yeah? Yeah. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather light. Good. That's real good. The county fair was held the last weekend of August when the heat had finally broken and the nights were cool enough to sleep without sweating. Florence transformed for the occasion. The main street lined with booths selling everything from pies to saddles, and a makeshift arena set up at the edge of town for the rodeo events. Willa had not been to a fair since she was a child, and she had forgotten the noise and color of it, the way it felt like the whole world had gathered in one place. Preston picked her up in a wagon borrowed from the ranch, and they rode into town together with the horses tied to the back. Willa had worn her best dress, a blue calico that she had sewn herself, and she had braided her hair with ribbons that matched. Preston had cleaned up too, his shirt pressed and his boots polished, and he kept glancing at her like he could not quite believe she was real. They spent the afternoon wandering the fair, stopping to watch the pie-eating contest and the log-splitting competition. Preston bought her a ribbon for her hair from a peddler's booth, a length of green silk that he tied into her braid himself, his fingers fumbling slightly with the delicate fabric. They ate fried bread and drank lemonade, and they laughed at the absurdity of a man trying to wrestle a greased pig. But it was the evening that changed everything. The rodeo events were winding down, and the crowd had gathered near the arena to watch the final competition, a horse race that would loop through the town and back. Preston had entered Jasper, and Willa stood at the rail with her heart in her throat, watching as the horses lined up. Preston caught her eye from across the arena and waved. Then, to her shock, he dismounted and walked over to Clementine, who was tied nearby. He pulled a handful of wildflowers from his saddlebag, flowers he must have picked that morning, and he began to braid them into the mare's mane. The crowd noticed. Conversation stuttered and stopped as people turned to watch. Willa could feel the weight of their stares, the curiosity and judgment, and she wanted to tell Preston to stop, to spare himself the embarrassment. But he kept braiding, his movements slow and deliberate, and when he was finished, he stepped back to admire his work. Then he walked over to Willa and took her hand. "I'm not ashamed of it," he said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Not anymore." Willa's eyes burned with tears. She had not realized how much it would mean, this public declaration, this willingness to be vulnerable in front of a crowd of strangers. She squeezed his hand and said, "I know." Preston won the race. Jasper flew around the course like he had wings, and when they crossed the finish line, the crowd erupted into cheers. Preston dismounted and walked straight to Willa, ignoring the congratulations and the prize money, and he kissed her in front of everyone. It was not a long kiss or a dramatic one, just a press of lips that tasted like lemonade and dust. But it was enough. Willa felt the world tilt and resettle, and when they pulled apart, she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Does this mean you're my girl now?" Preston asked, his forehead resting against hers. "I think it does." They courted through the fall, meeting as often as their work allowed. Preston would ride over to Willa's homestead in the evenings, and they would sit on her porch and talk until the stars came out. Sometimes he would stay for dinner, eating the simple meals she cooked with a gratitude that made her feel like she had given him a feast. Other times they would ride together, exploring the high country and the hidden valleys that only the locals knew. Willa had never been happier. Preston was everything she had not known she needed, steady and kind and completely honest. He did not try to change her or make her smaller to fit his expectations. He celebrated her independence, her stubbornness, the way she refused to ask for help even when she needed it. And in turn, she helped him open up, to share the parts of himself he had kept hidden for so long. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in October and blanketing the high meadows in white. The cattle were brought down to lower pastures, and the work of ranching shifted to feeding and maintenance. Preston spent more time at the main ranch house, helping his uncle with the accounts and planning for the spring, and Willa found herself missing him with an intensity that surprised her. They wrote letters when they could not see each other, long, rambling letters that covered everything and nothing. Preston's handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but Willa treasured every word. He told her about the ranch politics he hated, about the arguments with his uncle over how to manage the herd. He told her about his dreams of starting his own operation someday, something smaller and more manageable, and he asked her opinion on everything from breeding stock to fence placement. Willa wrote back with equal enthusiasm, sharing her own plans and frustrations. She told him about the fence she was repairing, the cow that had gotten stuck in the creek, the way the cabin felt too empty without him in it. She signed every letter with the same line, "Thinking of you always." In December, Preston asked her to marry him. It was not a grand proposal, no ring or bended knee. They were sitting in her cabin by the fire, sharing a pot of coffee and watching the snow fall outside, and he just turned to her and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Willa did not hesitate. Yes. They were married in February on a day when the sun was bright and the snow sparkled like diamonds. The ceremony was held in the small church in Florence, with Ruth as Willa's witness and Preston's uncle as his. It was a simple affair, no flowers or fancy clothes, but Willa wore wildflowers braided into her hair and Preston wore a matching boutonniere. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her like they were the only two people in the world. They honeymooned at Willa's cabin, snowed in for a week and perfectly content with it. They spent their days making plans for the future and their nights tangled together under quilts, learning the contours of each other's bodies. Preston was a gentle lover, careful and attentive, and Willa felt safe in a way she had not felt since she was a child. When spring came, they combined their operations. Preston moved his personal herd to Willa's land, and together they built new fences and expanded the pastures. It was hard work, back-breaking and exhausting, but they did it side by side, and that made all the difference. They were partners in every sense of the word, equals who respected each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. Their first child was born in the spring of 1887, a boy they named Frederick. He had Preston's dark hair and Willa's stubborn chin, and he screamed loud enough to wake the dead. Preston was terrified of him at first, this tiny fragile thing that depended on them completely. But Willa watched him learn to be a father with the same patience he brought to everything else. He would hold Frederick for hours, pacing the cabin and singing off-key lullabies, and Willa would fall in love with him all over again. Frederick was followed by Catherine 2 years later, a girl with Preston's gray eyes and a sunny disposition. Then Abigail, quieter and more thoughtful, and finally Eleanor, who was born in the summer of 1893 and had lungs that could shatter glass. Their cabin grew crowded and they built an addition, then another, until the house sprawled across the hillside like a living thing. The children grew up wild and loved, running through the meadows and learning to ride almost before they could walk. Preston taught them to braid flowers into the horses' manes, the same way his mother had taught him, and it became a family tradition. Every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed, they would spend an afternoon braiding, all 6 of them sitting in the grass and weaving colors into the manes of Clementine and Jasper, and the dozen other horses they had acquired over the years. Willa's ranch grew into something she could not have imagined when she first arrived in Colorado. They ran 100 head of cattle now, maybe more, and they employed 2 hands to help with the work. Preston's uncle had retired and left the family ranch to a cousin, and Preston had no regrets about choosing his own path. He and Willa built something together, something that belonged to them and no one else, and it was better than anything he could have inherited. They faced hardships, of course. A drought in 1889 that killed half their herd. A winter so cold in 1891 that they lost all their chickens and nearly froze to death themselves. Frederick broke his arm falling out of a tree when he was 8, and Catherine came down with scarlet fever when she was 6, and there were nights when Willa thought she might lose her mind from worry. But they survived. They always survived. And in the quiet moments, when the children were asleep and the work was done, Willa and Preston would sit on their porch and watch the stars, and they would remember how it all started. 2 strangers braiding wildflowers into their horses' manes, speaking a language that only they understood. By 1895, their ranch was one of the most respected in the valley. They had earned it through hard work and good decisions, and also through the kindness they showed to their neighbors and hands. Preston had a reputation for being fair and honest, and Willa was known for her generosity, always willing to lend a hand or share what she had. Their children were polite and well-mannered, and people spoke of the Nichols family with respect. It was in the spring of 1895 that the county held another fair, the first in several years. The children were wild with excitement, and Willa spent weeks sewing new dresses for the girls and new shirts for Frederick. Preston took charge of training the horses, working with Frederick to teach him the basics of racing and showmanship. The morning of the fair, they loaded the wagon with supplies and children, and they set off for Florence as a family. The horses followed behind, their manes braided with wildflowers, every single one of them. It had been Preston's idea, a callback to that first fair when he had braided Clementine's mane in front of the whole town. Willa had loved the idea immediately, and they had spent the previous day picking flowers and braiding until their fingers ached. The fair was even bigger than Willa remembered, the town overflowing with people from all over the valley. They set up camp near the arena, the children running off to explore while Willa and Preston unloaded the wagon. Ruth found them within the hour, her face flushed from the heat and her arms full of packages. "Well, look at you two," she said, grinning. "Still braiding flowers after all these years." "Some traditions are worth keeping," Preston said, slinging an arm around Willa's shoulders. "I'd say. You two are proof that a little tenderness goes a long way." The fair was a blur of activity. Frederick entered the junior roping competition and placed 3rd, his face glowing with pride. Catherine and Abigail won ribbons for their pies, and Alina charmed everyone she met with her gap-toothed smile. Preston competed in the horse race again, and though he did not win this time, he came in a respectable 2nd. But the moment that Willa treasured most came in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and golden, and the crowd had gathered for the final event. Preston had arranged for a special exhibition, a demonstration of horse braiding that would showcase the art form he and Willa had turned into their signature. They stood in the center of the arena with Clementine and Jasper, and they braided the horses' manes in real time while Preston explained the process to the crowd. He talked about the importance of patience, of taking the time to do something beautiful even when the world demanded efficiency. He talked about the language of flowers, the way each bloom carried its own meaning, and how braiding them together was a way of speaking without words. Willa watched him as he spoke, this man who had been so reserved when they first met, and she marveled at how much he had changed. He was still quiet, still careful with his words, but he was no longer afraid to show the softness inside him. He had learned to embrace it, to wear it proudly, and it had made him a better man, a better father, a better husband. When the demonstration was finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Preston bowed slightly, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and then he turned to Willa and kissed her. It was a quick kiss, nothing scandalous, but it was enough to make the crowd cheer louder. "Still making a spectacle of yourself," Willa murmured against his lips. "Only for you," Preston replied. That evening they gathered with their children near the edge of the fairgrounds, away from the noise and crowds. They spread a blanket on the grass and ate the leftover pie, and they watched the stars come out one by one. Frederick was half asleep, his head in Willa's lap, and Alina was curled up against Preston's chest. Catherine and Abigail were whispering to each other, their voices soft and conspiratorial. "Mama," Catherine said suddenly, "why do you and Papa braid flowers in the horses' manes?" Willa exchanged a glance with Preston. It was a question they had been asked 100 times, by neighbors and friends and strangers, and the answer had changed over the years. But tonight, with their children gathered around them and the stars shining overhead, she wanted to give them the truest answer she could. "Because," Willa said slowly, "sometimes the most important things we say aren't said with words. Sometimes they're said with actions, with kindness, with beauty. Your father and I started braiding flowers because we wanted to speak to each other in a language that was just ours. And even now, after all these years, it's still our way of saying I love you." Catherine considered this, her young face serious. "That's nice, Mama." "It is nice," Preston agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "It's one of the nicest things I've ever been part of." They stayed there until the children fell asleep, and then they carried them back to the wagon and drove home under a sky full of stars. Willa rested her head on Preston's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, and she thought about how far they had come. From strangers braiding flowers to a family with roots deep in the Colorado soil. It had not been easy, but it had been worth it. Years passed. The children grew and married and had children of their own. Frederick took over the ranch when Preston's back started giving him trouble, and he ran it with the same care and fairness his father had. Catherine married a schoolteacher and moved to Denver, but she came home every summer with her family. Abigail stayed close, marrying a neighboring rancher, and Alina shocked everyone by becoming a doctor, one of the first women in the state to do so. Preston and Willa grew old together, their hands weathered and their hair gray, but their love as strong as ever. They still braided flowers into the horses' manes, even when their fingers were stiff and the work took longer. It was their ritual, their way of remembering who they had been and who they still were. One spring morning, when Willa was 70 and Preston was 73, they rode out to the high meadow where they had first met. It was the same meadow, unchanged by time, the wildflowers blooming in riotous color and the stream running clear and cold. They dismounted slowly, their bodies protesting the effort, and they sat on the same rock where they had shared coffee all those years ago. "You ever regret it?" Willa asked, her hand in his. "Choosing this life," Preston looked at her, his gray eyes still sharp despite the wrinkles around them. "Not for a second. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, they made the good parts better." Willa leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence, listening to the sound of the water and the wind. After a while, Preston reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of wildflowers, slightly crushed but still vibrant. He stood and walked over to Clementine, who was grazing nearby, her mane now streaked with white. He braided the flowers into her mane slowly, his movements still practiced despite the years. When he was finished, he stepped back and nodded, satisfied. Then he walked over to Jasper, who was standing beside Clementine, and he did the same. Willa watched him with tears in her eyes. This man, who had been a stranger once, who had spoken to her in a language of flowers and patience. This man who had become her partner, her love, her home. "Come here," Preston said, holding out his hand. Willa stood and went to him, and he pulled her into his arms. They danced there in the meadow with no music but the wind and no audience but the horses. They danced until they were breathless and laughing, and then they sat back down on the rock and watched the sun climb higher. "I love you," Preston said, his voice steady. "I love you too," Willa replied. They stayed in the meadow until the afternoon, talking about the past and the future, about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and the land they had built their lives on. And when they finally rode back home, their horses' manes were braided with wildflowers, a testament to a love that had started with silence and patience and had grown into something unshakable. The years continued to pass, but Preston and Willa remained constants, anchors in a world that was always changing. They watched the 20th century arrive, bringing with it automobiles and electricity, and a pace of life that felt almost frantic compared to the slow rhythms of their youth. But in their corner of Colorado, time moved differently. The seasons still turned, the cattle still needed tending, and the wildflowers still bloomed every spring. Their grandchildren loved to visit the ranch, drawn by the stories of the old days and the promise of wide open spaces. Preston taught them to ride and to rope, while Willa taught them to cook and to sew. But the lesson they loved most was the one about braiding flowers, the story of how their grandparents had fallen in love through a wordless conversation written in petals and stems. "Tell us again, Grandma," they would beg, and Willa would smile and begin the tale. She told it simply, without embellishment, but the children hung on every word. They loved the mystery of it, the romance, the idea that love could begin with such a small gesture. Preston would sit nearby, whittling or mending tack, and he would add details when Willa forgot them. He remembered the exact shade of the first columbine he had braided into Clementine's mane. He remembered the way his hands had shaken the first time he saw Willa, afraid she would think he was foolish. He remembered the moment at the fair when he decided he did not care what anyone thought, as long as she knew how he felt. The grandchildren would listen, wide-eyed, and then they would run off to practice on their own ponies, weaving daisies and clover into tiny braids that came undone almost as soon as they were finished. But Preston and Willa did not mind. They knew that the skill would come with time, and what mattered was that the children understood the spirit of it, the idea that beauty and kindness were worth the effort. In the spring of 1903, the family held a gathering to celebrate Preston and Willa's 17th wedding anniversary. All 4 children came home with their families, filling the ranch house to bursting. There were 18 people in total, counting the grandchildren, and the noise was overwhelming and wonderful. They set up tables outside, under the trees, and they spent the day cooking and eating and telling stories. Frederick roasted a pig over an open fire, a skill he had learned from one of the ranch hands, and Catherine made her famous apple pie. Abigail brought fresh bread from her own kitchen, and Alina brought flowers from Denver, exotic blooms that the children had never seen before. As the sun began to set, Preston stood and raised his glass. The conversations died down, and everyone turned to look at him. He was not a man who made speeches, and the attention made him uncomfortable, but he had something he needed to say. "I just want to thank all of you for being here," he began, his voice rough. "Your mother and I, we built this place from nothing. We worked hard and we had our share of struggles. But we also had more love and more joy than we ever thought possible. And that's because of all of you." Willa reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Preston cleared his throat and continued. "I've been thinking a lot about the past lately, about how things started, about the choices we made and the roads we took, and I keep coming back to the same thought. Everything good in my life started with a simple act of kindness, with taking the time to do something beautiful for no reason other than it felt right." He paused, looking around at the faces of his children and grandchildren. "I hope you'll all remember that. In a world that's getting faster and harder, don't forget to slow down and braid the flowers. Don't forget to speak the quiet language of love." There was a moment of silence, and then the table erupted into applause. Willa wiped at her eyes, trying not to cry, and Preston sat down quickly, his face red. But the children came over to hug him, one by one, and the grandchildren climbed into his lap, and he felt lighter than he had in years. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Preston and Willa sat on the porch and looked out at the dark shapes of the mountains. The air was cool and smelled of pine, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Willa was wrapped in a quilt, and Preston had his arm around her shoulders, and they did not need to speak to understand what the other was feeling. "You think they'll remember?" Willa asked after a while. "The lessons we tried to teach them?" "I think so," Preston said. "They're good kids. They've got good hearts." "I hope so. I want them to be happy, Preston. I want them to find what we found. They will. Maybe not in the same way, but they'll find it." Willa leaned into him, closing her eyes. "I'm tired, Preston, not in a bad way, just tired." "I know, me too." They sat there for a long time, holding each other, and when they finally went inside to bed, they were smiling. Preston passed away in the winter of 1910, quietly and without fanfare. He had been chopping wood for the stove when his heart gave out, and he collapsed in the snow. Willa found him there an hour later, and she knew immediately that he was gone. She sat beside him in the cold, holding his hand, and she cried until there were no tears left. The funeral was held at the church in Florence, and it seemed like half the county turned out to pay their respects. People spoke about Preston's kindness, his fairness, his quiet strength. They spoke about the ranch he had built and the family he had raised, but Willa barely heard any of it. She was lost in her own grief, a grief so profound it felt like drowning. The children wanted her to move in with one of them, to leave the ranch and let someone else take care of her. But Willa refused. The ranch was her home, the place where she had built her life with Preston, and she could not imagine leaving it. She stayed, living alone in the big house, and she spent her days walking the land and remembering. Every spring she still braided wildflowers into the horses' manes. It was harder now, her fingers stiff and aching, but she did it anyway. It was her way of keeping Preston alive, of honoring the love they had shared. She would sit in the meadow where they had first met, and she would braid flowers into Clementine's mane, and she would talk to Preston as though he were sitting beside her. "I miss you," she would say, her voice quiet. "I miss you every day, but I'm grateful for the time we had. I'm grateful for everything." Willa lived for another 8 years, long enough to see her youngest grandchild graduate from school and her oldest great-grandchild take his first steps. She remained sharp and independent until the end, refusing to let age slow her down. She passed away in her sleep in the spring of 1918, on a morning when the wildflowers were in full bloom. The family buried her beside Preston on a hillside overlooking the ranch. They planted wildflowers on the graves, columbine and lupine and Indian paintbrush, and they made sure the flowers were always braided into the horses' manes when they visited. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down from child to child, and the tradition of braiding wildflowers continued. It became a symbol of the Nichols family, a reminder of the love that had started it all. People in the valley would see the braided horses and know they belonged to the Nichols ranch, and they would smile and remember the story. And on quiet spring mornings when the wildflowers bloomed and the air was cool and clear, you could almost see them there in the meadow. A cowboy and a woman, sitting side by side on a rock, their horses grazing nearby with wildflowers woven into their manes. A love story told in silence, in patience, in the small acts of beauty that make life worth living. The legacy Preston and Willa left behind was not just the ranch or the children or the land they had tended so carefully. It was the reminder that love does not always announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it speaks in whispers, in the language of wildflowers and braided manes, in the quiet moments when two souls recognize each other across a meadow. Their story became part of the valley's history, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But for those who had known them, who had seen the way Preston looked at Willa and the way she smiled at him, it was not a legend at all. It was simply the truth. Two people who found each other through patience and tenderness, who built a life on the foundation of small kindnesses, and who loved each other until their last breaths. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the Colorado mountains, their descendants would gather at the ranch for a celebration. They would spend the day braiding flowers into the horses' manes, all of them together, continuing the tradition that Preston and Willa had started so many years before. The children would laugh and play, the adults would share stories, and everyone would remember. At the end of the day, they would stand together on the hillside where Preston and Willa were buried, and they would look out over the land that their ancestors had built. The meadows would be golden in the setting sun, the mountains dark against the sky, and the horses would stand in the pasture with wildflowers woven into their manes like crowns. And in that moment, they would understand. They would understand that love is not something that fades with time or diminishes with age. It is something that grows, that deepens, that becomes woven into the very fabric of the land and the people who tend it. It is something that begins with a single braid of wildflowers and continues through generations, passed down like a precious heirloom, treasured and protected and celebrated. Preston and Willa's great-great-grandchildren still live on the ranch today, running cattle and tending the land just as their ancestors did. They still braid wildflowers into the horses' manes every spring, and they still tell the story of how it all began. The story of two strangers who spoke to each other in silence, who found love in the most unexpected way, and who built something that would last long after they were gone. Because some traditions are worth keeping, some languages are worth speaking, and some love stories are worth remembering, long after the people who lived them have returned to the earth. Preston and Willa's story was one of those. A story written in wildflowers and patience, in braided manes and quiet mornings, in the slow unfolding of two hearts learning to beat as one. And it all started with a simple act of beauty. A few stems of columbine woven into a horse's mane, a silent message sent across the miles. A conversation that began without words and grew into a love that would echo through the generations. As enduring and beautiful as the wildflowers that bloom in the Colorado mountains every spring.